Now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. So we've been talking in the whole first hour with Brien Foerster about the elongated skull people of, well, South America, but also the ones from around the world, and always fascinating stuff. And now we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit and start talking about Rapa Nui, better known as Easter Island. So, Brien, welcome back to the show. How are you after a little break?
Great, thank you.
I always laugh when I talk to you. I don't know why. But anyway.
Hopefully it's a good thing.
So one of the things I remember years and years and years ago, there was a show on TV that was talking about Easter Island. And I don't remember if it was Eric Von Donigen's, Chariots of the Gods that they had made into a movie, or if it was a thing with Thor Heyerdahl. But I just remember, there are certain things that just make this impact in your mind, and I just remember being blown away by those massive stone heads going, oh my God, how or why would people carve these things? And here you are, you got to go there and check them all out for yourself, and so I want a full report. So what was that like? What was it like going to Easter Island, a.k.a. Rapa Nui?
Well, it was great because I've loved Polynesia since I was a kid. I went to Hawaii the first time when I was 12. I lived there. I've been there multiple times. I've been to Tahiti and the Cook Islands, and I know a lot of Maori people from New Zealand. So I've always had this affinity for, what is called Polynesia, or the Polynesian people. So it was great to go there because it's such a tiny little island. It's 5 miles by 7 miles by 10 miles, more than 2,000 miles away from anything. And that by itself makes it intriguing. But it was it's the fact that the people there are wonderful. The island is incredibly mysterious, and almost everything that's ever been written about that island by archaeologists is complete garbage.
Now, why do you say that?
Well, that was the great thing, is that I was fortunate that many years ago, I met a member of the royal family of Rapa Nui on Hawaii, because I was involved in a Polynesian canoe building project. And so when my wife and I went to Rapa Nui in February, we were trying to find a place. We had a place to stay. We wanted to find another place to stay, and we just got into conversation with this woman. And I mentioned this lady's name, and she said, "Oh, she's here on the island now. Would you like to go see her?" And so I said, "Sure." So she was wonderful, and she recognized me and said, "Well, I'd like to show you the island." And so for the next 4 days, she was our guide, and she debunked almost everything that's ever been written about Rapa Nui, mainly because she says archaeologists have never gone to her or her family or the people to ask the history of the island. They always make up their own ideas. And so that was probably the most profound thing, was everything I learned has never been written in a book, as far as I know.
So what kind of things did you learn that is not part of history, or, the written, known history? I mean, what kinds of things?
Well, conventional archaeology says that Rapa Nui, or Easter Island, was the last of the island groups populated by the Polynesians, that they first arrived in Samoa and Tonga, then they went to Tahiti and the Marquesas, because they're very close to each other. And then they migrated north to Hawaii, southwest to New Zealand, which is called Aotearoa by the Maori people. And finally, the last outpost was Rapa Nui. And my friend said, no, they've got it all backwards. Rapa Nui is the first island that was populated by these people. So then you have to question, well, wait a second, if that's true, then where did they come from? And that's where the whole thing began to get, even more intriguing. And that was the beginnings of basically my book Crimson Horizon started from that point, because since I'd done a fair bit of research, actually based on Thor Heyerdahl's work of possible connections between South America and Polynesia, the pieces started to fall into place thanks to my oral tradition expert.
So if they didn't come from Polynesia, then how did they get there? Where did they come from?
Well, they did. I mean, the majority of the people who live on Rapa Nui are of Polynesian descent, but there was an earlier culture that lived there prior to them, and they were. If anyone's seen the movie or has read anything about Rapa Nui, they'll have heard of the long ears and the short ears. The long ears are supposed to have been the ruling class of people. They were taller than the Polynesians, supposedly, and they had red hair. This is where we're getting back into the red hair thing. So genetically, they were different from the Polynesians, but over time, of course, there's mixing and, but the amazing thing is that I started to see people on Rapa Nui with this, this reddish brown hair. And when I asked my friend, is that guy part Irish or something? And she said, no, that's a very ancient bloodline. There's a very specific clan who have that hair color.
Do they have long ears too?
Well, no, the long ear thing was something that was a ritual practice done where they would wear really big earrings and they would distend their earlobes on purpose, much like the Inca did, and that's where we start to get into the connection. There is a bloodline connection between the coast of Peru and Rapa Nui.
That's really interesting. Any thoughts of who, was it a group of Inca that went there, or could it have been the other way around, that a group from Easter Island, got tired of their 5 mile by 5 mile patch and decided to head east? Had to think about that a second.
Well, the thing is that in the oral traditions, it's known that one of the Inca, one of the great Inca, and actually one of the last ones, that he made a journey westward and came back either 9 months or 2 years later. And so it's believed that he went to Rapa Nui. But we're looking thousands of years before that, because the first of the, according to my source, she said that the great, first person or famous person of Rapa Nui was called Hotumatua, and he was the first of the Polynesian people, most likely, and he arrived there 2,000 years ago, which is 1,000 years earlier than what most archaeologists say. But she's, the thing is that when you deal with oral traditions and people, you can't bug the hell out of them with questions all the time. So sometimes she would throw little side things in at me, and she'd say, yeah, Hotumatua was the first, this is a statue of his son. He arrived 2,000 years ago, and he was a latecomer. So she was telling me that people had come, long before that time.
Right. I mean, if he was a latecomer, that implies that there were already people there.
Yeah.
Like Columbus, he was a latecomer. Sorry.
Well, even when Van Roggeveen, who was he's the one he was Dutch. I think in 1720 he arrived there, and he was the first known European to arrive, and he's the one who named it Easter Island because he landed there Easter Sunday. But his description was he saw different classes of people. He saw, what we would call Polynesian-looking people, but he also said that he saw tall, very light-skinned, red-haired, and blonde-haired people.
Interesting. And were they more the ruling group also?
Yeah, they were what was left of that. They were what was left of the ruling people, because there were a number of internal conflicts that happened prior to that, and much more after that. That's what people don't understand about Rapa Nui, is that there's all this talk about that, the people became overpopulated, they denuded the island of all the trees, they resorted to cannibalism, And according to my source, she said that's complete nonsense. All of that awful stuff that happened occurred after contact with the Europeans, which is, common. These people either on purpose or by accident bring diseases, et cetera, et cetera. And all of the major conflicts happened as the result of introduced diseases causing social breakdown and all sorts of other things.
Yeah, that's interesting that would just kind of, they wouldn't really notice that part in the history books.
Well, it's also a racist statement, which you get time and again.
Yeah.
Often when you get, European scholars imposing their ideas, like no one, even the most famous of the archaeologists who have studied Easter Island, according to my source, who was born there and grew up there, she said none of them ever approached her family and asked them anything. Like, where do you guys come from? What's this? What's that? It's like, no, we have our own theories. And so the Rapa Nui people basically would just laugh at them. But the unfortunate thing is that most of the world thinks that the stories written about Rapa Nui by archaeologists are the truth, when in fact they aren't. Nobody's going to be so stupid as to cut down the last of the palm trees on the island, which is what a lot of archaeologists assert happened.
So were there trees on the island?
She says
really?
Yes. Yeah, she says there have always been trees. The Rapa Nui people did cut down a lot of the forest because they had a growing population, so they needed land in order to grow crops and things to feed. But they didn't reach a point of where they had cut everything down and resorted to eating each other as a result of it.
So then what happened to the trees? The ones that were left, because from what I understand, there's like 3 trees on the whole island.
No, that's not, that's the thing. When I went there, there is extensive forest there.
Okay.
But the important point is that what happened is that a Chilean, actually an English-based company, I think in the 1860s or something, was given the allowance by the Chilean government, who are still the overlords of the island. They stole Rapa Nui from the people. They allowed this company to bring sheep and cattle, and the sheep, to turn the whole island into a ranch. And so the sheep and the cattle and the goats just ate everything, which is what happened in Hawaii too. And the people themselves were isolated to this very small area and were not allowed to leave. Basically a prison.
And they didn't create civil war? I just can't even imagine. The Native Americans against the United States government and the United States people, that's kind of outnumbered. But you would think on a little island like that, they couldn't send in that many people. No, well, the thing is that, again, I recommend my book because it does tell you the history. And what happened was that, Roggeveen shows up, encounters the people, leaves, probably by accident, I would think. There was contact between the people, and so on a small island like that, all of a sudden you have these introduced diseases, like even the common cold or something, which devastates a lot of the population. So by the time Captain Cook shows up in the 1770s, he finds these, what were once these happy, abundant people are suddenly living in caves. They have almost nothing to eat. They're very, very destitute at that point. And even worse, what happens is then the Chileans grab the island and they send slave ships over. And I think it's more than, at that time there were 3,000 people on Rapa Nui. More than 1,000 of the people, including most of the royal family, the priests, and anybody else, any man and woman who is of any strength and vigor, is dragged off the island, taken to these islands, which are actually just off Paracas, where I'm at. They're called guano islands because they're islands where millions of birds live, and they produce so much bird dung, which is great fertilizer,
that these Rapa Nui people are literally dumped on these rocky outcrops and made to harvest the dung until they drop dead. So of the 1,000 people taken away, only 15 of them made it back. And those 15 of them were carrying smallpox. So the population of Rapa Nui, which at the time of contact was most likely 5,000 or 6,000, was reduced in the 1880s to 111 people. And as well, you've got the goats, you've got the sheep, you've got the cows, they're eating everything. So that island has been devastated more by outside influence than any other, and that's why I was so in love with the place when I got there, because the population now is like 3,500. Very warm, gentle, true people of Polynesian character in that, come to my house, we're having a barbecue today. They still have their oral traditions, which is amazing because the population, as I said, was down to 111 people.
Yeah, no kidding. Wow.
And they still know the history. They still have an incredible artistic ability, dance, singing, knowledge of the language. And I was so fortunate to be able to, live with Rapa Nui people for for a week we were there, and it was like beautiful, beautiful experience.
Mm-hmm. And you're going back, correct?
Yeah, I'm going back in November with Dr. Robert Schock, Hugh Newman, and Megalithomania. But I think what we should really get into, if you want to, what we should get into are some of the other misconceptions about the island, including the figures, which are absolutely astounding if you're actually there looking at them. It's one thing to see a photograph of, this big dark head sticking out of the ground, but the actual story behind them is absolutely amazing. Like the amazing ability of a people 2,000 miles from anywhere with limited resources, and what they pulled off, was, to me, high civilization.
Well, and I did want to go there. I mean, because one of the things that I was misled was that I just thought they were these giant heads, except for the little grouping with the red hat things on, but it was just these kind of heads, and they were big, but that was, that was pretty impressive. However, what I've been seeing is that they've been doing some excavations of some of the Moai, and what they're finding underground makes it even more fascinating. So anyway, I'm going to give that to you.
Okay. Well, the important thing to know is there's no such thing as an Easter Island head. Each one is the sculpture of a human body. So when you see the pictures of the heads, what you're looking at is what's above the ground. What's underground are the complete bodies. So some of these are more than 30 feet tall. And there's actually one in the quarry which wasn't finished, but it is estimated to, if it had been finished, it would have been 60 feet tall and would have weighed 200 tons.
Wow. So how, like the Egyptians and these other builders, how did the Easter Island people move these sculptures?
Well, the basic story of how they moved them was that the majority of them were from this one quarry called Rana Raraku. And it's quite the stone is not really super hard. It's quite soft. So what they would do is they would shape the body, the top and the sides, and then they would start to cut underneath until they reached a point where the figure could basically be snapped off the base. And then they would raise it up to its full height, again, some of them being 30 feet or more tall, and with a series of pulleys and ropes from the top of the crater, which is above that. They made, this is where the term comes, they walked. They made the Moai walk down the hill, meaning that they would release one rope and then hold it firm, release the other rope, hold it firm. So they would pivot and wobble their way down to the main road. From there, they would be moved on rollers to different parts of the island and then fully erected. And what's important to know about the ones that still have the red top knots on is most archaeologists say, well, they represent some kind of hat. And before I went to Rapa Nui, I was doing my research about, well, if that's a hat, who else in Polynesia wears hats like that? And the answer is nobody. So from that, I was able to ask my informant and say, what do these top knots represent? And she said, that's their hair. And I said, they're red. And she said, yes, because they had red hair.
Huh. Interesting. That's interesting. I mean, I remember I took a primitive arts class, but it was through the anthropology department, and they would talk about how in their little tribal battles, they would try to knock the red hair off of the statues. I mean, I don't know if it was a prank thing or what, but you look at the picture, and it's like, how did they even get it up there in the first place in order to knock it off?
Yeah, well, they're called, the name of the top knot is called a pukao, and some of them weigh 11 tons. So how they were able to do that is, I don't call a high civilization one that has, necessarily cell phones and cars, but it's a civilization of people where they're able to maximize the use of what they have. And in the case of Rapa Nui, you're talking about a tiny island. And what they were able to achieve was masterwork.
Well, but what I was just thinking, they have a very finite, obviously, population, so they couldn't have 100,000 workers working on this stuff, or thousands and thousands of workers working on this stuff. I mean, I always have the image of, Egypt, and they got the big block of stone and the rollers, and they got, the 500 people pulling the block across the sand, but they didn't have that luxury of even having that many people to do this kind of work.
Well, that's true, but that whole thing's a fallacy too.
Well, I know.
Yeah, but but the thing is, most of the listeners won't know that, because almost anywhere you go, it doesn't matter if it's in South America, Central America, Egypt, even Stonehenge. I was in England about 2 months ago with Hugh Newman and Gary Evans and people. And even with Stonehenge, they show the same, it's almost as though the same artist did it. You have one guy in fancy clothes pointing with his finger, and then all these slaves pushing these big things, whether it's blocks for the pyramids, the Moai, Stonehenge, etc. And it's all it's a farce, because that is the interpretation of Western academics. If you ask the actual people and say, how did you do this? They'll tell you, well, we used these things as rollers, blah, blah, blah. We had an ingenious way of maximizing the workforce without, torturing people. So that's the thing that people have to understand is a lot of what's written about indigenous people, no matter where on the planet you go, is often, very nonsensical, because the people themselves haven't written the story. It's somebody trying to interpret without asking the native people, how did you pull it off? And it's like, well, we did this. It's like, oh, that's ingenious.
How old are the Moai supposed to be?
Excellent question. As far as I know, the oldest of the big ones is almost 2,000 years old, and that is a depiction of the son of Hotumatua, who was the first, great Polynesian king. But that's where Dr. Robert Schock comes into play, because he was there 2 years ago and actually got married there. And being a geologist, he noticed that some of them, not too many, but some, are made out of basalt, which is an incredibly hard stone, whereas the other majority of the Moai are made out of volcanic tuff, which is quite soft. And so his question was, what tools could they have had to shape basalt? And the only tools he could find were basalt. So cutting basalt with basalt is very difficult, because it's almost like trying to carve wood with wooden chisels. So he was only there for a week, as far as I know, and I saw this documentary about a year ago that he and others had made, where he was trying to recruit a crew to go back to Rapa Nui so that he could explore, where the basalt comes from and how they were made, and that's exactly what we're doing in November.
Excellent. I mean, because one of the things about them is they're so big, and if you're only seeing the head, that means that you have at least 20 feet dug into the ground, which to me would say that, either there was some kind of a landslide or flood or something, natural disaster that happened that buried those things so deeply in the ground, or they've been there a long time and erosion has buried them.
Well, the thing is, what my informant said is that they were that was done on purpose by the people.
Really?
In order to do the finishing work. What they would do is they'd walk these multi-ton statues down the hill that have a very big hole dug for it, and then they would lower it down inside so that they could do the finishing work, because they had to be standing in order to be able to to do the fine finishing work. And then there was an event that happened which transformed the entire social structure, and that's that the long-eared people, who were the overlord kind of people supposedly, they were overthrown, and they were the ones who were the depictions of the Moai. That's what they represented, that's what their ancestors represented. And it was the shorter-eared people, who were the greater population, that, there was some kind of war, but it wasn't like they were completely exterminated. It's just it was like, look, you've been in charge of us for a long time. We're kind of sick and tired of working for you. You're dethroned. And that's when the whole, some people may have heard of the Birdman cult, and that's when the Birdman cult started, because the end of the social hierarchy of the long ears ended. And so that's when the Moai construction immediately stopped. And, there are more than 200 of them which are sitting at the quarry, up to their necks buried, basically, because, that was the end of that period of their history.
About how many of these statues are there on the island?
Between 900 and 1,000.
God, that's a lot of statues.
Yeah, they're all over the place. It's amazing. It's amazing. You just drive down the road. There's the main road is a circle road that goes around the island, and it takes like an hour and a half or 2 hours maybe to do. And as you drive, you have to keep your eyes open because of the not only the devastation of disease, but also I think it's about the 1860s or so, a priest, of course, is sent over, Catholic priest. He says, "Oh my God, you people are savages. All these big stone things that you've made, or God doesn't like that, so rip them down." And so the people were brainwashed to knock the Moai off of their pedestals and their temples. And also the people of Rapa Nui had a written system, a hieroglyphic system of writing called Rongo Rongo. And this priest went all over the island. Most of the Rongo Rongo was written on wood, and so he grabbed as many as he possibly could, brainwashing the people, saying, "You don't need this anymore because we got this thing called a Bible, and you're going to learn Spanish. Here you go." And then he burnt them all. So he burnt the written tradition of Rapa Nui.
It must have been the same guy that was in, Mexico. That burned all the Mayan books.
Well, it's the same. Yeah, it's the same approach. You find that amongst the Inca too, because the Inca had the quipu system, which was a series of knotted cords used for accounting, and it was also a language. And that's what the church did as well, because the thing you want to do when you're doing conquest is you want to belittle people as rapidly as possible. So if you take away their cultural identity, then they're easy to manipulate. And so by the burning of the quipus, the burning of Rongo Rongo, the burning of, the Popol Vuh, et cetera, you leave these people vulnerable, and then you immediately impose new stuff. Like on their temples, you build churches and you stick a cross on and say, everybody's a Christian now, or it's not only the Catholics or Christianity. It's any belief system that has had expansionistic ideas always does basically the same thing. belittle the people, destroy their history, and then impose your concept on them.
I just find it so hard to believe that, well, one, that we've done that, we being Western society, but two, that they were able to get away with it. I mean, I just, can't imagine that a group from somewhere would come into the United States and be like, this is how it is. And Americans, and it might be an American thing, and Americans going, oh, yeah, right. I just can't even imagine it.
Mm-hmm.
So, where it would just not be an issue.
Yeah, that's true. But I mean, it happened in the United States. It happened in Canada. It happened in Mexico. It happened all over the world. It's not just necessarily Western people who have done this. That's the nature. That's the nature of conquest.
Oh, I don't.
The sad nature of conquest.
The sad nature of conquest.
Yeah.
Are there any conehead people? Okay, so we have the redhead people that are noble, so we have that connection. Were there any elongated skulls found on Rapa Nui?
Actually, that's an excellent question.
Come on, I'm tying it all together here.
That's you're amazing at that. You always have the right question at exactly the right time, Rita. And the thing is that because I developed this theory that people from possibly the Paracas area in antiquity were sailors, because they were deep water fishermen, they were whale hunters and stuff, so they had to go way offshore to do that, which meant they had to spend, overnight on the ocean, which meant they had to know star navigation to get home. So my theory was, what if they just kept going, based also on Thor Heyerdahl's work. So we wanted to take some ceramic conehead shapes that a local potter, ceramicist Senior Victor made as gifts to the mayor of Rapa Nui, to develop a cultural exchange. And my lady informant on Rapa Nui, I gave her one too, and she just looked at it and she said, "These people used to live here too."
Get out of town.
And that's the that's the nature of learning oral tradition, is that you're not necessarily going to get a half-hour, discussion. They'll throw things at you like that. It's like, Hotematua, yeah, he was a latecomer. Or, with the coneheads, yes, they used to live here too. It's like, let's have lunch. It's like, no, wait a second.
Wait, I have questions.
No, we have to eat. And it's like, and what she's trying to do, and what my other, native elder teachers throughout my life have always done, is they like to throw these nuggets at you, because that's, for her to say that is enough for me to spend a week processing it and go, wait a second, I have to come up with a really smart second question now. And I love that. It's like, no, I'm not going to answer any more questions. We're having lunch. Oh, okay. But yeah, she said that they were there, and I said, oh, okay, are these the long ears? And she said, yeah, something like that. But the thing is that Polynesian people are incredibly respectful when it comes to bones of ancestors, and so you don't have anybody's skull on display in a museum on Rapa Nui. Because they're the term they use, or the name they use, is iwi, and that's also what the Maori call it, and in Hawaii it's called iwi, and that's they believe that at least part of the solar spirit still resides in the bones. So you're not allowed to put them on public display, you're not allowed to own them, you're not allowed to touch them. They have to be hidden, they have to be buried. So of course, my question was, where can I see one? And she said, no, they're buried. Now we're having dinner.
For real.
Yeah.
And what I think is interesting, too, you mentioned that Cusco is the navel of the world. And isn't it culturally on Easter Island, they believe that Easter Island is the navel of the world?
Yeah. One of the names for Easter Island is Te Pita o Te Henawa, and it means the navel of the world. And Cusco also means the navel of the world. Redhead,
conehead people. in the navels. See, I think it would be interesting, just using that criteria. Anyway, but I'll leave that project for you to do. Because I know you'll get there. I just think that there's some connection with that whole navel of the world because there are too many of them, but I don't know. Anyway, that's what my little intuition's saying, that there's a connection there. Okay.
Well, I think so. And again, the question is, why is it called that, and what is it referring to in terms of the world? And I think, according to my lady friend, she said the first of the Polynesian people lived on Rapa Nui. That's why it's the navel of their world. It's not the world; it's their world. And even the Maori high priest people go back to, or they go to Rapa Nui and they break down crying because they say, this is where we come from. But that's something that your listeners won't have known about because, again, most academics write that everybody came from Asia and traveled east. And in my book, Crimson Horizon, what I'm showing is because I'm a sailor, I looked at the logic of how you could travel from South America through the Polynesian chain up to Hawaii, down to New Zealand, and it's actually quite simple. And that's what the concept of Crimson Horizon is all about, because on Hawaii, you also find people who still have red hair. In Tahiti, you still have people who have this reddish-brown hair. And in the Maori, you still have people who have the reddish-brown hair.
What about the whole thought, about the lost island of Mu? I mean, could they have been connected because there had been some supercontinent or a more robustness in the island chain so that it was easier for people to navigate across the Pacific?
I think very much so. And what people have to take into consideration is, if you're a seafaring people, there's no such thing as one-way travel. So that's, it's so simplistic to say, that the Tahitians went east and then they wound up in Rapa Nui, then they stopped, and that was the end of the story. With people like David Hatcher Childress and Christopher Dunn and Graham Hancock and Robert Schock, et cetera, we're all looking at the same idea now, and that's that for thousands upon thousands of years, people were traveling on the ocean all over the world, and it wasn't one culture doing it. It was continuous. This continuous movement of people over time, racial mixing, genetic exchange, cultural exchange, etc. The best theory I have for Lemuria or Mu is the fact that all of the Hawaiian islands, or at least Maui, Molokai, Lanai, and Kaho'olawe, were all one island 12,000 years ago. And the Big Island would naturally have appeared to be closer. Oahu would have appeared to be closer. And I think that's what Lemuria or Mu was. Even in some Hawaiian traditions, they talk about the idea, or the fact, according to them, that they've lived there for 25,000 years. Even though academics, again, say, no, you came from Tahiti 1,000 years ago. They're saying, it's our story. You can't tell us our story.
And it sounds similar to the story you talk about with the Inca culture, where they say, oh, well, they set up shop like 900 AD, but there seems like there's evidence that there's cultures that go back further in time. Like when we talked about Pumapunka, and you asked the people, well, who built it? And they were like, well, it wasn't us. And it sounds like a very similar situation, that there was a first cluster of people, and then other people have brought their history, and that's the one. They're just looking at the top surface level and not really digging down into the deeper, older history of the islands.
Well, exactly, and the same case in Inca country or Lake Titicaca. You can't, to some degree, it's difficult to talk to the people now because we're talking thousands upon thousands of years of culture, and the latest people who are there, like even the native people, are not necessarily descended from the megalithic builders. That's especially the case around Tiwanaku, because the Aymara people who lived there, who are the native people, they've been there as the dominant culture for about 1,000 years. They're the ones who kicked the Inca out of there and forced the Inca, or at least the last wave of Inca, to move north. And so asking them, who built Pumapunku, which is probably 15,000 or 20,000 years old, they have no clue, because it doesn't relate to, it culturally and historically has nothing to do with them, even though that will offend them if you say that. So I have to be careful. I'm going there in a month.
He said it in a very loving way. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Did you find other parallels between the culture of South America and on Rapa Nui?
Well,
not necessarily culture, but architecture, anything.
Yeah, actually, that's one point. Is that and that's where, again, Thor Heyerdahl has been vilified and crucified by a number of academics, and I'm not necessarily beating up on academics in general, just specifically in cases like this, because he didn't have a PhD, he probably wasn't included in the club of those who did. So his theories were maverick, but I think they were correct, and often it's people from the outside who come up with the intelligent answers, because they're standing outside of a box and looking in, whereas often academics are inside a box and they don't even know that they're in the box. So he saw this one wall at this place called Vinapu on Rapa Nui, which faces east, as in it's facing South America. And because I've been to Cusco 21 times, and all I do is stare at stone walls when I'm in Cusco pretty well, that one wall at Vinapu is astonishingly similar to the ancient pre-Inca structures around Cusco. And so there's very good chance that the ancient megalithic builders who preceded the Inca spent time on Rapa Nui, built a structure there, possibly either stayed as the Long Ears. Some of them might have moved on elsewhere. But that's a concrete example of a relationship between the two, because the majority of constructions on Rapa Nui are of Polynesian age and Polynesian configuration, Polynesian construction, but that one stands out, like very much like a sore thumb.
And if the ones in South America end up dating to, or the other cyclopedian megalithic structures around the world, end up dating to 15, 20, 25,000 years old, it would also make the first habitation of an advanced culture on Easter Island be that old as well.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what's wonderful about the latest work that we're doing, thanks to people like Stephen Mailer and Robert Schock, Barbara Handclough, who you may not have heard of, who's an absolute genius.
We've had her on like 3 or 4 times. She's a big.
Okay.
We get along really good. But yeah,
okay.
What is she doing with you guys? Tell. I mean, I know she does a lot of work with the Mayan calendar and Kaliman's work, but what's her connection to you? Interesting.
Well, I don't actually know her yet, but we're working more and more on this. We're trying to figure out how the Ice Age ended, and we know it ended about 12,000 years ago. And the more evidence that's starting to show up is that there was this galactic event that came from, it was either the blowing up of a supernova, or it was an outburst from galactic center in our Milky Way galaxy that caused this pulse of energy and radiation to move across, move through space, go through the sun, cause a massive ejection of energy from the sun to strike specific parts of the Earth and cause this scorching, this almost like crematorial effect in certain places. So that's why we're thinking that, especially in Egypt, which I'll be going to in April, but in Peru as well, you have this weird seeming scorching of these ancient stone structures. And if we're able to date that, as being the result of this event 12,000 years ago, then obviously those structures are older than 12,000 years ago.
So similar to some of the structures that they found in, like, and I want to say Great Britain, Ireland, that look like they were melted?
Yeah, that too. That's another thing that I was very fortunate when I went to England, was the fact that I was involved with people, the very few that exist in England. You know, it's like anywhere. There are always very few people who really know the ancient stuff. But it seems like the history of Great Britain and Ireland are far older than even the Celtic people, and that there were these ancient megalithic builders there too who built these round towers that still exist, that exhibit this scorching effect to the outer surface. And again, that might be explained by this galactic event that happened, which occurs, according to, if you haven't had him on, you should have him on, Dr. Paul Laviolette. He said this happens every half-precessional cycle. So approximately every 12 to 13,000 years, you get this outburst from galactic center. And that's what a lot of these calendars are based on, too. You know, if the whole thing about precession of the equinoxes, which is this 26,000-year cycle, is known by basically any culture that has any great history. So it's not simply the Maya who were, you know, the Maya are special, but it's not just the Maya. It's many cultures talk of the same thing, you know, the same cycle happening, the great cycle.
Well, something I find interesting that I don't have an answer to because I haven't had the time to investigate it yet, but it's on my list of things to investigate, is that there is this something, I'm just going to say something, happened in that period, and I'm just going to be extremely generic, of about 3,500 BC, somewhere between 3,100 BC and 3,600 BC, that in two cultures were identified as a creation event. You know, once is the Maya, once is Jewish, and then in the third culture, it's when Krishna left the earth and we entered into the Kali Yuga. And it's like, why are three different cultures within less than 1,000 years all identifying this little period of time as the time of a new beginning? And if it's a new beginning, what is it a new beginning of?
Huh. Yeah, other people have mentioned that time frame. I unfortunately know almost nothing about it.
Yeah, and like I said, I haven't researched it yet, but it just, you know, it's one of those things that sits in my brain going, okay, there's something significant here. And in our history, it's really not that far back in time.
No, not at all. You're absolutely correct. I think what's intriguing is that more and more we're getting hard data to back up, you know, some of these ancient oral traditions of, you know, this supposed Atlantean culture that existed. And I think people are looking too simplistically at there having been a continent in the middle of the Atlantic that sank. I think that's an oral tradition story that says that something happened to cause the landmass to disappear. The obvious answer to that would be, you know, the raising of the global oceans 10 to 12,000 years ago as the result of the melting of the ice caps. You had 350-foot rise in global sea level. But it's all these old stories that, you know, people say are fairy tales, and they're not. You know, there's something in there that is real, that is trying to tell us, because it's like what Stephen Mailer, based on what his old teacher Hakim, who was the Egyptian oral tradition specialist, said, you know, and I'm paraphrasing again, but that's it. You know, when people are looking for the halls of records, the ancient buildings themselves are the halls of records. It's just you have to be able to decode what they're trying to tell you. Every single block, every single brick, every single angle, the position of the building, its orientation to the sun, all of this is information that the buildings are trying to tell us. You know, they're trying to tell us who made them, why, when, and how.
And then we turn around and just take some little thing and make up some whole other context and meaning to it that has no connection to any kind of truth.
Well, exactly, and the greatest example possibly of that is the Great Pyramid in Egypt. Just because some guy called Khufu said that, decided to name it after himself, doesn't mean he built it. It would be a natural thing. I'm the pharaoh. That's the biggest building. That's mine. And then over time, it's like Khufu likes the Great Pyramid, and then it becomes Khufu's pyramid, and then it's Khufu built the pyramid. But it's nonsensical.
No, there is a cartouche up in one of the levels of the chambers above the king's chamber that actually says that it was built by Khufu. However, no one's ever tested the pigment to see if it was a forgery. I mean, that's the part that makes me laugh. It's like, no, look, it says it right here. It's in writing. It's right here. And I'm like, okay, but has anybody tested the validity and whether that inscription is a forgery or not? Because if it's a forgery, then everything that you guys have been saying for the last however many 100 years is a lie.
Yeah, well, and another point is you have this building, which thankfully I'll be, like I keep saying, we'll be seeing in April of next year, which is an engineering complete masterpiece. Astonishing level of technology involved to build it. And then somebody paints a crappy cartouche on the inside and says, here's the proof. I mean, it's like somebody taking a key to a car, scratches their name into it, and then everyone from then on worships it as Bob's car because Bob must have designed it and built it because he put his name on it.
Right.
It's nonsensical.
Well, I mean, in Egyptian tradition, I mean, Stephen Miller, you've mentioned him, and we know that he is an excellent Egyptologist scholar. What does he attribute? Does Egyptian tradition attribute the pyramid to Khufu? Or is it just, Westerners that give him that honor?
Well, I can't talk too much for Stephen, though I love to, because I love the man. But he basically what he says, based on what Hakim said, unfortunately Hakim died a few years ago, but he was a descendant of the Cometian people, and the Cometians go back thousands of years before the pharaonic Egyptians. And what they say is the Great Pyramid was there before the pharaohs showed up. And also the Sphinx was there. The head of the Sphinx was recarved by one of the pharaohs because he was in charge and he decided, I want my head on that thing, carve something. But that's, you find that globally in terms of traditions. You have a people moving into a land. Everyone thinks that they're the original inhabitants, but they're not. They inherit buildings and play around with them by carving their own stuff on the surface or whatever. Definitely the case in Cusco. Cusco is thousands of years older than the Inca. And one example is that Stephen and Chris Dunn both sent me pictures recently of this incredible granite surface, like flat, perfectly flat. And it's all carved in hieroglyphics. But the quality of workmanship of the hieroglyphics is something that a 10-year-old with a nail could have done. The surface itself is technically astonishing. So clearly that tells me that whoever put the hieroglyphics on the surface came much later than the maker of the surface itself.
Amazing. Brien, we only have like a minute left, so if people want to get your 2 books or any of your books, where would be the best place for them to go check that out?
The best is my website, www.hiddenincatours.com, and they're also available on Amazon as well.
Okay, and if they want to check out some of the pictures, they can go to Hidden Inca Tours on Facebook? That would be the best place?
Or they can subscribe to my page, my Brien Foerster page on Facebook too.
No, they just already told me that you can't see. You're private, so unless you're a friend, you can't access it.
Oh, well, that's the limitation. But the thing is, the Hidden Inca Tours website gives you like Facebook links. It gives you Twitter links. It gives you links to my video collection, which is hiddenincavadeos.com. That's where I put all of my best and latest videos. I'm also on YouTube as well, but I've got almost 700 videos on YouTube, so it's hard to navigate, whereas the hiddenincavadeos.com website has everything categorized. So if you want Puma Punku, then there's a bunch of videos about that. If you want Easter Island, there are videos about that kind of thing.
Okay. Excellent. So what are you thinking about working on next? I mean, I know you got some traveling going on, but are you going to do another book on the elongated heads, or what's the next project you have coming up?
Yeah, actually right now, and just before I was talking to you, I'm working on my book, Lost Ancient Technology of Peru and Bolivia, and I'm not going to finish that until at least after the Chris Dunn tour, because I would love to have Chris's input. So I'll have to negotiate with him on the tour and see how much of his stuff I can use. And then I might also wait until the Robert Schock tour is over as well.
Well, all right, Brien, we need to go. Thank you so much for coming on and hanging out with me. I always love having you on. You know I love you to death.
Well, the feeling is completely mutual, Rita. I love my experience with you every second of the time.
Okay, well, I will talk to you again soon. Folks, that's Brien Foerster. His webpage is hiddenincatours.com or brienfoerster.com. Next week, we have Dr. Moai Pressman talking about finding your twin soul, and Richard Dolan talking about AD, after disclosure. Anyway, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. You've been listening to Just Energy Radio. Thank you all for tuning in, and until next week, be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise